That was the senior deputy governor of the Bank of Canada sounding off on lagging productivity in this country, describing it, as you heard, as an emergency. Carolyn Rogers told a business audience in Halifax this week that not only is our economy's performance on the productivity front in much worse shape than the U.S., but it also has a material impact on inflation and the bank's efforts to tame it. To unpack the deputy governor's warning, I'm joined tonight by Pedro Antunes. He's the chief economist at the Conference Board of Canada. Hi, Pedro. Great to see you. Thanks for making the time.
It's a pleasure.
Before we get into exactly how it was characterized by Ms. Rogers, I wanted to ask you, for people watching who don't converse daily on productivity, which is most people watching, including myself, like, how would you best define productivity in layman's terms?
Yeah, I think, well, one word, it's prosperity. Essentially, when we're talking about GDP per hour work, that's typically what, economists or jargon is telling us about productivity. What it is essentially the income generated by economic activity divided by essentially worker hours, how much effort we put in per person hour worked, and how much incomes that's driving. So that's really important because income is essentially our wages, it's our profits, and it's also what governments tax to provide our social programs and other services. So I would just say, essentially productivity is the driver of our prosperity, of our purchasing power, and our ability to afford programs.
Do you agree with the deputy governor's assessment that it's in an emergency state at this moment?
Yeah, well, I think we've been hammering on this for a long time, and it's getting worse and worse is the problem. And especially in the last year where we've seen the U.S. economy really forging ahead, whereas in Canada, if you look at what's happened in Canada, especially in the last year, we've seen essentially the economy stalled and we're continuing to hire. So we're not getting really any additional GDP or output or income for those additional worker hours put into the economy. So our productivity has really plummeted in the last year. And, so this, I think there's some parts that are cyclical to this. There's other parts, and I think the deputy governor really made the point, that are really easy to track. It's just our investment, our ability to attract, private investment in productive capital. So think of machinery and equipment. The deputy governor made a point of comparing somebody with a shovel versus with a snowblower or with a truck. Very different output per person hour worked in those situations. So that's a really important piece as well.
So what's the culprit? Like, why is it that we aren't investing in those? Why are we buying the shovels and not the other stuff? Is it decisions on the part of business not to make those types of investments? Is it a reliance on other things that supplant that? What do you believe is the culprit?
Well, I think, again, if we go back kind of longer term to some of the kind of the trend issues, we hear it from businesses. It's nothing new here. It's our ability to be competitive on, for example, the tax bill. We had corporate taxes that were, in line with the U.S. prior to the tax cuts in 2017 that President Trump put in place. That's no longer the case. We're no longer competitive on taxes, for instance. When we look at, essentially the ease of getting a projects approved and the ease and certainty of having an investment come to fruition, I think that's a major problem in Canada, and that continues to hinder us. And then there's competitiveness issues. Not competitiveness issues, but protectionist issues coming from south of the border. So, when we're tearing up NAFTA, that is very scary for Canadian businesses who need access to U.S. consumers. So all of these are just a few of the pieces I think that we know are hindering investment in Canada. And if you look more recently now, well, guess what? The economy is in a slump. Profits are down. And we're seeing, essentially business investment continuing to fray in comparison to the U.S. and other jurisdictions.
Yeah, the deputy governor pointed out, relatively speaking, Canadian productivity back in 1984, the economy was producing 88% of the value generated by the U.S. economy per hour. By 2022, it had fallen to just over 71% relative to the United States. We're just a few weeks out from the federal budget. Is there anything that can be done from a federal policy perspective? And I don't want to instigate that or insinuate rather that it's going to be a quick fix, given that this has been a problem for so many decades. But what would get the ball rolling in the right direction in your view, if you could isolate one thing?
Well, I mean, I think tax reform, tax competitiveness. I don't think it's going to happen in this budget, but I think that's something we need to think about again. We're going the route of subsidies, and I don't know that this is rather than being an even keel on the subsidies, a level playing field. We know we've targeted certain industries, and I worry about governments picking winners specifically. So, I would rather see something that's more broad that helps, competitiveness, and that's one thing that the deputy governor, talked about at length. And of course, another piece around competitiveness is one that we've long known about, and that is, being able to size up businesses because of access just in Canada. So interprovincial trade barriers. That's been 20, 30 years that we've been discussing this,
Yeah.
but that's another one that keeps coming up, and I think was hinted at this after in that speech.
Yeah, interesting. The U.S. is subsidizing, with their own IRA, so much of the industry there, yet they remain pretty competitive. That's a conversation for another day. I hope I can pick your brain on another instance. Mr. Antunes, Pedro, I appreciate the time.
It'd be a pleasure. Thanks.